what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 860, I call up the bill, H.R. 1836, as amended, and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 159, H.R. 1836, a bill to amend Title 38 United States Code to ensure that the time during which members of the armed forces serve on active duty for training qualifies for educational assistance under the Post-9/11 Educational Assistance Program of the Department of Veterans Affairs and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 860, in lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Veterans Affairs, printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 117-25 is adopted, and the bill, as amended, is considered read. The bill as amended is debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs or their respective designees. The gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Bost, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on H.R. 1836 as amended.
Without objection.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1836 as amended, Representative Levin's Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act of 2021. This bill is a long-needed fix to the unequal treatment of members of the Guard and Reserve for GI Bill purposes. Under current law, Guard and Reservists do not accrue education benefits the same as their active duty counterparts, even when they are carrying out the same risks and duties and taking on, while carrying out the same duties and taking on the same risks. We live in a new age of national defense where we utilize the total force concept with an operational reserve, not a strategic reserve. We rely each day on Guard and Reservists to protect and defend our country. And as we observed the anniversary of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, we were reminded of the brave Guard and Reserve troops who deployed to protect Congress, our staffs, and the foundation of our democracy. We continue to rely on our reserve components throughout the COVID-19 pandemic to activate and support public health response efforts across the country. The National Guard has been utilized at unprecedented levels in recent years. And over the past 2 years, our reserve components have fought wildfires, responded to protests, and assisted with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and even helped Afghan refugees settle in the United States. It is time the Guard and Reserve benefits reflect the key work they are doing and the need for equity across the total force. It is time for every day in uniform to count. The cadence of activations for Guard and Reservists has increased significantly over the last 5 years. And with that comes the need to meet mission readiness standards. To prepare for the critical role they fulfill in our national defense, Guard and Reservists must frequently train, which means more days in uniform, more days away from their civilian life, and more days away from their families. The GI Bill is both a recruitment and transition benefit to help service members transition into civilian life and close the opportunity gap with their civilian peers. The Guard and Reserve need this more than ever as they are continually and constantly transitioning between military, civilian employment, and family life, facing continuous disruptions. This legislation rectifies the disparity and ensures that members of our reserve forces know that every day they commit to our nation counts, and that they will have the education benefits waiting for them when they fulfill their commitment. In both this and the 116th Congress, we reformed and updated the post 9/11 GI Bill to ensure students who are eligible have easy access to high-quality education. We've implemented strong student protections, and we are holding bad acting institutions accountable when they fail to meet standards we set for veteran education. Now, if service members can step up and do their part day in and day out while holding down civilian jobs and squeezing in time to take care of their families, then the least we can do here in Congress is to get out of the way of the solution. Now, there are troubling reports of upticks in suicide among our Guard and reservists. One of the best ways we can address veteran health, mental health, and ultimately veteran suicide is by providing veterans with support and a pathway to a successful civilian life. H.R. 1836, as amended, will give Guard and reservists access to the opportunities that post-secondary education and training provide and improve their reintegration into civilian life. This legislation is fully paid for and uses loan fee provisions that this Congress and prior Congresses have supported. In addition, even the Republican substitute uses the same offsets. Besides just being the right thing to do, investing in equitable GI Bill benefits for Guard and reservists will provide more than a tenfold return to our country. Who are we to stand in the way of an educational benefit that will not only make our country stronger, but will benefit our military by having military service members in our Guard and reservists who are even more able to do their jobs in behalf of our national defense. I can't wait to see what our service members will do with this opportunity, and I know it will make our country a better country. This legislation is endorsed by numerous VSOs, including the American Legion, the VFW, Student Veterans of America, the National Guard Association of the United States, Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States, and Reserve Officers of America. And I ask unanimous consent to insert these letters of support and statements from the American Legion, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the National Guard Association of the United States, Military Veterans Advocacy, and Reserve Officers of America into the record.
Without objection.
Now, I wish to thank Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Leader Steny Hoyer, for considering this legislation today, and I urge the rest of my colleagues to support this legislation to ensure every day a Guard or reservist spends in uniform counts toward earning vital GI Bill benefits. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 1836 as amended, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act of 2021. While I support the intent of this bill, I do not believe that it is the right solution for our National Guards and Reserves at this time. Founded in 1636, the National Guard evolved from groups of colonial militia into one of the toughest and most professional fighting forces in the world. From defeating the British during the American Revolution to fighting in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the reserve component has served in every major conflict in the history of this nation. In recent years, the Guard and Reserve has been called up more often as their mission has changed. These brave men and women are not only on the front lines overseas, but they're also deployed at home to protect southern border and assist in response of COVID-19, among others. We must never forget the sacrifice the men and women in the Guard and Reserve make when the federal government calls on them to serve. I agree that Congress must take a hard look at duty status reform and the potential expansion of benefits for Guard and Reservists. But this bill before us today would be an unwise expansion of benefits. The higher level of sacrifice of active duty service members is reflected in the higher level of benefits provided by the VA. This is why the government recognizes the increased sacrifices of the reserve component when they are called up on most federal active duty orders. I believe that one of the biggest misunderstandings in this debate is that many of the types of federal active duty services that members of the National Guard and Reserve perform already qualify for the GI Bill eligibility. I support the goal of ensuring that all time spent on non-training active duty federal orders should count towards GI Bill eligibility. However, the bill before us today would go far beyond that and provide eligibility for the GI Bill for service related to annual training and drilling weekends. Training has never counted towards eligibility, and members of the Guard and Reserve know that when they sign up. Let me say that again. Training has never counted towards eligibility with members of Guard and Reserve. They knew it when they signed up. It's the additional call-ups to federal active duty service that members of the Guard and Reserve may not know about. This type of service would be covered by Congressman Moore's amendment, which I believe is a better alternative. Also covering training is the largest cost driver of this bill, which leads to my second point. The CBO projects that the expansion of this benefit laid out in this bill would require nearly $2 billion in mandatory offsets for the first 10 years following its enactment. While these costs are paid for in a current budget window, that does not tell the whole story. CBO also estimates that this bill will cost taxpayers more than $5 billion in each of the next 4 decades after fiscal year 2032. This would be equal to at least $20 billion extra dollars over the next 50 years. None of these extra costs are offset, which means our children and grandchildren will be paying for them off and be paying them off for many, many years to come. In a tight physical environment, I believe that full active duty benefits for training and drilling is a bridge too far. I'm also concerned that the offsets that are used in this bill should be saved for higher priority issues like expanding services to toxic exposed veterans. Addressing the needs of toxic exposed veterans is both mine and Chairman Takano's #1 issue that we're trying to deal with right now. That could require Congress to find hundreds of billions of dollars of offsets. Offsets are few and far between in the VA committee. We will need every penny of them to enact these needed reforms that we were talking about earlier. Earlier this week, before the Rules Committee, Chairman Takano indicated that $2 billion is an insignificant amount compared to the potential full cost of addressing toxic exposures, and therefore is not worthy to try to save. I disagree. It is silly that I even have to say this, but $2 billion is a lot of money. It's worth saving. Ask any taxpayer. And remember, the people we're talking about are taxpayers as well. Like me, my constituents and many Americans are concerned that Congress doles out billions of taxpayer dollars like candy. Now that must end. We can't provide the needs and benefits for veterans. We can provide the needs and benefits without burdening future generations. But that requires Congress to make tough decisions and to put first things first. Many of my concerns could have been discussed, debated, and possibly even addressed if the majority had conducted the proper level of engagement with committee members, VA, and other stakeholders on this bill. The majority did not hold a single legislative hearing on this bill this Congress. As such, we were not able to receive views from the committee members, the administration, the mortgage industry, or veteran service organizations. Those views are a critical part of the legislative process. Why was this still not put on the agenda for one of the 2 legislative hearings the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity held for this Congress. This is no way to be responsible legislative. And I implore the Chairman Takano to go back to our committee in a bipartisan tradition of conducting full legislative due diligence before sending bills to the House floor. In closing, I'm supportive of reviewing, and where warranted, expanding benefits for members of Guard and Reserve. However, we must do so in a way that is fiscally responsible, appropriate, and respective to the many differences between Guard and Reserve service and active duty services. The bill before us today does not meet that standard. I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves, and the gentleman from California is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I yield to my distinguished colleague, I'm going to just make a few remarks in reference to what the ranking member said. I want to first of all say that the bill has been in the public for more than 2 years. In fact, the committee held Guard and Reserve only benefits hearing just over a year ago to review the disparity in these benefits. And we've worked closely with the stakeholders, as evidenced by the numerous number of VSOs whose support letters I've entered into the record earlier. And we've also worked with the minority to ensure that this bill achieves the aims that we intend. We've also worked closely with the Department of Defense and VA to ensure all Guard and Reserve members are covered. The VSOs have been asking for this reform, and that is why we stand with them in support of H.R. 1836. Now, moreover, you know, before the Rules Committee yesterday, it is not accurate to say that I characterized the $2 billion cost of this bill, which is paid for, as insignificant. I merely compared it to the the idea that we should use this bill as part of an offset for the $300 billion or so that we are going to need for toxic exposure. And I thank the ranking member for joining me, for joining together and trying to find a solution for our toxic exposed veterans. However, that $300 billion, I know we're going to find how to take care of that. It is really not a choice. It's a moral obligation that we have to those veterans that were exposed to burn pits. It's not a choice. It's a cost of war that we have got to rise together as a body. And look, we found $30 billion willy-nilly to add to the defense authorization. We will find the $300 billion. We don't need to be nickel and diming our reservists and our Guard units and deny them the days that should count toward their GI Bill benefits because they're doing every bit the same sort of readiness training that our active duty service members are doing. And so that I now would like to yield 5 minutes to my good friend and chairman of the Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity, and who is also the author of this very impressive bill, Representative Mike Levin from my own state of California.
Thank you for yielding, Chairman Takano, and thank you for all of your support and your partnership on this legislation and all the work that you do leading our committee. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act, bipartisan legislation I introduced to deliver some basic fairness to the way we provide GI Bill benefits for the men and women who serve our nation. Mr. Speaker, the GI Bill has allowed millions of veterans to pursue a higher education and find rewarding career paths. Service members consistently cite GI Bill benefits as one of the top reasons they choose to serve in our armed forces because of the opportunities those benefits provide for them and their families. However, the way that we allow service members to accrue GI Bill benefits is inherently unfair. Well, active duty service members receive credit for GI Bill benefits every day that they're in the service. Guard and Reserve members only accrue those benefits in very limited circumstances. That disparity continues to exist, despite the fact that Guard and Reserve members are increasingly taking on the same risks and doing the same jobs as their active duty counterparts. We've seen this trend for decades, but it has become especially pronounced over the last 2 years. In response to the attack on our Capitol on January 6th of last year, 25,000 National Guard members mobilized from 54 states and territories to protect this institution. For a time, they slept on the cold, hard floors of this building. National Guard members have also deployed across our country to support the COVID-19 response, including Guard members who deployed from Ohio, Maryland, Delaware, and Georgia to assist healthcare operations this month. In 2020, 1,300 soldiers and airmen from 5 different states were mobilized to fight wildfires in my state of California and throughout the West Coast. Not only are these National Guard and Reserve members risking their lives to serve our country, but they're also forced to put their civilian lives on hold when they're called up, leaving behind their families and interrupting civilian careers. Similarly, they're forced to put their lives on hold every time they're called up for training. In some of those settings, they are serving side by side with active duty members, doing similar jobs and facing similar risks, but they're not earning the same GI Bill benefits as their peers. That's unacceptable, and it's shameful that we've asked Guard and Reserve members to step up in response to natural disasters, the pandemic, and an attack on our democracy without providing them with this fundamental benefit. Clearly, it is long past time that we provide some basic fairness in the way that we allow Guard and Reserve members to accrue these benefits. The legislation that we're considering today will do exactly that, with a simple fix to ensure that every day they spend in uniform counts towards their GI Bill benefits. Now, I know my friends on the other side of the aisle might raise concerns about the cost of expanding eligibility for these benefits, and I'd note that this bill includes provisions my Republican colleagues have supported in the past to help defray the cost of veterans' benefits. And to my colleagues who still aren't willing to pay for these benefits, I would ask them to share their concerns directly with Guard and Reserve members the next time they're deployed in response to a natural disaster or other emergency in the community that they represent. So I think we all want the same thing. My friends across the aisle, us on this side of the aisle, we all want the same thing. We all want to provide benefits to those who have served our country. I believe that in good faith. I do think that we have to not pay lip service, though. We have to make sure that we support service members, and not just when it's politically convenient. We don't need half measures. We don't need things that shortchange our service members. So I think it is time for us to step up. It's time to give them the benefits they've earned for protecting the American people in a way now that they are doing unlike before. And that's what this bill aims to do. As the chairman mentioned, it has support from a wide range of veteran service organizations, including the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Student Veterans of America, the National Guard Association of the United States, the Enlisted Association of the National Guard of the United States, and the Reserve Officers Association. They are asking us to pass this bill, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act, today because they agree that it's past time to provide some basic fairness in the way that we provide GI Bill benefits to Guard and Reserve members. Passing this bipartisan bill is the right thing to do for all the men and women who serve and protect our nation, and I urge my colleagues to vote aye. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Mr. Levin yields. Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just quickly before I yield time to my colleague from Ohio, I would like to remind the members that, training for members of National Guard and Reserve has never been counted towards GI Bill eligibility. Members of Guard and Reserve know that, as I said in my opening, when they sign up. Now, the Democrat majority did not hold a legislative hearing on this bill, so to that extent, the expansion of the eligibility was needed to increase recruitment and retention within the Guard and Reserve component and DOD. But DOD did not have the opportunity to testify to that before the committee because we didn't meet. With that, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman who has actually served both in reserve and active component of our military, and Brad Winthrop.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I rise today to discuss H.R. 1836, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act. As a member of the Army Reserve, I know the critical role that reservists and members of the National Guard play in defending our great nation. Unfortunately, I also know firsthand that sometimes unique skills and experiences that guardsmen and reservists bring to the table have been discounted or underutilized. That has always bothered me, as I personally know of the expertise that exists in our Guard and Reserve and their capabilities. Great strides have been made to value the Reserve and Guard like we value active duty, and we've come a long way, and we need to continue that work. At the same time, I also know that active duty requires a level of commitment that does differ from the Guard and Reserve. Unfortunately, this bill has significant problems that prevent me from supporting it, which could have been worked out in the committee process had there been a full legislative hearing on it. And that's why I say I stand to discuss this bill, because this is the first opportunity I've really had to discuss it. H.R. 1836 would provide Guard and Reservists with active duty service credit towards GI Bill eligibility for every day they're in uniform on federal orders, including training. So this is a status that has never been counted towards educational benefits. Now, as co-chair of the Congressional Bipartisan Burn Pits Caucus, and this committee's highest priority this Congress has been working to address the health effects of toxic exposures in the military, including from burn pits, I'm very concerned that the substantial spending in this bill could pull away from those efforts to address toxic exposure in this tight fiscal environment. I also have concerns that this legislation might continue a slow creep of a permanent federalizing of the National Guard, which was never the intent. We must be mindful not to usurp state authority of the Guard. What I do believe would be appropriate, however, would be to allow Guardsmen and Reservists to accrue GI Bill eligibility for any time spent on federal active duty service other than training, as many in this body that serve here in Congress have done as Guard and Reserve. I was called to active duty for 15 months, 12 months in Iraq. That should count. And that's a discussion we should have had on what actually should maybe count and what shouldn't, because I think there is common ground, but we haven't had a chance to discuss it. There's just the bill. Representative Moore has offered a substitute amendment which would do exactly that, and I hope my colleagues will support that amendment like I do. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill as offered and to instead support Representative Moore's substitute amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio yields.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are plenty of instances where training time and readiness training has counted toward the GI Bill. We talk about the basic training that reservists and guard unit members go through. That has counted toward the GI Bill. And if there's a worry about the federalization, I mean, just federal dollars already pay for the training days that we are seeking for the Guard unit members and and the reservists to get credit for. And with that, I would like to yield 3 minutes to my good friend and member of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs and the chairman of the Subcommittee on Technology and Modernization, the gentleman from Indiana, Chairman Mervan.
The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Takano, for your time. It is my honor today to rise in support of H.R. 1836, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act. I am so grateful for the sacrifices and the services of all our National Guard and Reserve members. They stand ready at a moment's notice to protect our nation, our democracy, and the health of our communities. 2 instances jump out at me when I think of the heroism of the Indiana National Guard members from this past year. The first was being able to spend time with our brave National Guard members last year in the cafeteria of the Department of Labor on the other side of the Capitol complex, when they bravely rushed to our nation's capital to defend our Constitution and to protect our democracy. The second was when I was able to stand side by side with them in the city of Gary when they operated a federal COVID-19 vaccine site, which provided over 60,000 vaccines in Northwest Indiana at a critical time during our pandemic. The 1st District is also home to the proud Slovak community, and I'm particularly appreciative that the Indiana National Guard has a flourishing military partnership with our strong ally, the country of Slovakia. We also have the 113th Engineering National Guard, which I have shared time with, who the men and women have sacrificed their time, dedication, and efforts to go over to Afghanistan. And what this bill does is it gives us the opportunity to have equitable training and equitable educational opportunity for our National Guardsmen. Our nation today has the opportunity to treat their active duty of service on par with all branches of the military and ensure that every day the National Guard Reserve member serves our nation in uniform is a day that counts toward their GI Bill benefits. Thank you to the leadership of Congressman Mike Levin, Chairman Takano, and all of my fellow members of the Veteran Affairs Committee for your commitment to our Guard and Reserve members and for bringing this measure to the floor today. I also want to thank Chairman Takano on his leadership to protect the National Guardsmen on the burn pits and the toxic fumes that we have passed, and how we are providing benefits and making sure that that is distributed fairly and equitably and making sure they receive the benefits necessary. I urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation. And again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from California
I reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, or Speaker. At this moment, I would like to yield 3 minutes to a man who has truly experienced what it is to serve, the highest-ranking officer that serves in this body today, and that's General Jack Burkman.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Bost. I'm always proud to stand on this floor and talk about the men and women who serve our country, and it is our country. I rise in opposition today to H.R. 1836, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act of 2021. And it kind of saddens me that I have to rise in opposition because while this bill, well-intentioned, is unfortunately potentially prone to unintended consequences on the overall readiness of our armed forces, active, reserve, and guard. But first, I must note that these issues could have been brought to light earlier had this piece of legislation gone through regular order, received proper consideration across all the normal things that we historically have done. It received no legislative hearings, foregoing the opportunity to receive input from key stakeholders, veteran service organizations, new committee members on both sides of the aisle, and even the Biden administration. Without that engagement, we're just left with a bill that in its current form, which would count Guard and Reservists' federal active duty service days towards GI eligibility, including for training. And there is a very subtle difference. In fact, it's a very exact difference in law between active duty for training and active duty. I spent much of my 40-year Marine Corps career in the reserve component. And in fact, a little known part of my bio, my first 2 years off of active duty in the Marine Corps, I spent 2 years as a member of the Rhode Island National Guard. So not only active component, reserve component, but also a guardsman as well. And you know, my final assignment for 4.5 years, I commanded. I had the blessing and the opportunity to command the Marine Corps Reserve, roughly 100,000 folks and 183 sites across the country at a time when we were deploying them at never-before-seen rates. I will always stand by the unwavering service and sacrifice given by the men and women in the reserve component and the National Guard. This bill, however, may unintentionally, again, become an obstacle to the recruitment and retention efforts of our active component military. We are in a time, and have been for over 40 years, of an all-recruited force on all levels. Even as governors already offer non-GI Bill education benefits to their Guard members, the parity with
gentleman's
active
time's
duty
expired.
forces that H.R. 1836 is seeking.
I'd like to yield the gentleman 2 more minutes, please.
Thank you.
Gentleman
Thank
is recognized.
you. My passion, I guess, is extending into time, and I thank the gentleman for that. Even as the governors already offer non-GI Bill education benefits to their Guard members, the parity with active duty forces that this bill is seeking for the Guard and Reserves, again, could impact our active duty military, which we need to be ready at all times considering today's global threats. Today, with more than 4 years after my colleagues and I passed into law an unprecedented GI Bill expansion to allow any veteran to use these GI Bill benefits without benefit or without restriction of time, so they're good to go for as long as they live, I still believe there are many ways that we can work responsibly to expand these benefits. For these reasons, I will be voting in favor of my friend and colleague Mr. Moore's benefit expansion amendment to ensure Guard and Reservists accrue GI Bill eligibility during any and all federal active duty days that are not training days. With that, I urge my colleagues to oppose the bill and support the Moore amendment, and thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Michigan yields back. The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, how much time is remaining?
The gentleman from California has 13 and a half minutes.
Great, thank you.
The gentleman from Illinois has 14 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield to a member of the committee who also serves as the chair of our subcommittee on energy and water and appropriations from the great state of Ohio, my colleague, Chairwoman Marcy Kaptur. I yield 3 minutes.
The gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, so very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1836, the National Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act. I thank the Chairman Takano and Representative Levin for their important work on this legislation that finally acknowledges the undervalued service of our Guard and Reservists. The sponsor's sentiments ring true. Every day in uniform counts. At least it should count more. In Ohio, there are over 11,400 National Guard members performing strategic and operational duties to whom we owe enormous gratitude. Our National Guard protects our homeland. It supports the mission of our troops abroad. It provides critical support to people in times of urgent need, from natural disasters to the public health COVID emergency we are in right now. The National Guard and Reserves have been an invaluable readiness resource throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, indeed, and are continuing to fill critical roles in response to the pandemic. In my home state of Ohio, the Ohio National Guard has helped the Ohio food banks distribute over 56 million pounds of food at 14 food banks and warehouses, including the Toledo Northwestern Ohio Food Bank. They've provided food banks the support they needed to keep children, seniors, veterans, and families fed during these very trying times. They set up COVID-19 testing clinics and traveled the state to keep our communities safe. And they are currently stationed at 12 testing locations across Ohio, and now, thanks to President Biden's executive actions, 2,300 Guard members have been activated across Ohio to help hospitals and public health experts care for those most in need, so all the Omicron variant patients that are flooding our hospitals have some hope of survival. The service and dedication of our National Guard and Reserves require that we appropriately recognize and appreciate their sacrifices, and while the debt we owe them cannot be fully repaid, the legislation before us ensures that these honorable men and women will receive the proper access to educational benefits they so rightly deserve. Providing these important GI Bill benefits will undoubtedly aid the recruitment and retention of National Guard units at home and abroad, while further investing in our service members' futures. With 6 National Guard sites in my own congressional district and several reserve units nearby, I know that this legislation will have a deep and lasting impact on our state's residents and those who answer the call to serve. It's certainly my privilege to represent these Guard and Reservists in Congress, and I'm proud to support enhancing the benefits that they can have access to and deserve for their service. May God be with all our men and women in uniform, and I thank you very much and yield any of my remaining time back to the chair, and I thank him again.
Gentlelady yields. The chair.
I thank the gentlelady and I reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to clear up some statements I think that were made for some of the people while talking, there was brought up that we actually have already dealt with toxic exposures, and we haven't. It's vitally important to understand that those costs that we're still going to be looking at, whether it's 300 or it's 150 or whatever it is, we haven't found that out or figured that out yet. It's vitally important to understand that it's still out there, and it is going to be a cost. And someone that we trust tremendously on watching our costs and watching our spending from our side of the aisle, who does a great job for us. I'd like to recognize for 3 minutes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman, the ranking member from Illinois, for yielding. Before we vote on new legislation, it's very important that we have an honest look at the price tag. As Republican leader of the House Budget Committee, it's my responsibility to track how new spending impacts our nation's bottom line. Every time Washington passes unpaid for legislation that adds a new benefit or program or expands an existing one, our fiscal problems get much worse. At each one of these moments, we take another step towards either raising taxes on middle and low-income working-class Americans or asking China for another IOU. Look no farther than the $2 trillion Biden bailout bill that was passed back in March. It added trillions to our nation's debt. And then also the multi-trillion, the $5 trillion BBB that was passed out of this House adds trillions to our debt. According to the Congressional Budget Office, that's the official scorekeeper for Congress, the true cost of the bill before us is hidden. The true cost before us is hidden. And why? On paper, the bill appears paid for. However, the new spending does not begin until 2025, and then the expansion of benefits does not go into effect until after the budget window in 2032. Meanwhile, the pay-fors all go away within the 10-year window. This is a creative way for Democrats to use budget gimmicks and delay program start dates to push through billions in unpaid-for spending. These types of budget gimmicks are exactly what Democrats have been doing with the $5 trillion spending bill that was called out, and why senators on the other side of the building will not support your legislation. And so Congress must stop kidding itself with fanciful accounting. Stop pretending that creating and expanding government programs, especially mandatory spending programs, that won't come with a real fiscal impact. And start being honest with the American people about the true price tags and the consequences of their reckless actions. I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
Reserve.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there has been an honest reckoning and an honest assessment by the CBO, and this bill is paid for according to the rules, and this is the same rules that my Republican counterparts observe. I'd like to, at this time, yield 3 minutes to my good friend and member of the Financial Services Committee, where he's chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Chairman Al Green from Texas.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise today in support of this legislation because the Guard and Reserve deserve parity. They have been there for us, and we must be there for them. When natural disasters beset the land and there are wildfires on the West Coast, they are there. When hurricanes ravage the Gulf Coast, they are there. When tornadic activities are all within the midsection of the country, they are there. They have been there for us, and we must be there for them. They do leave their families, just as the active duty service persons do. Yes, they leave their children. They leave their wives. They leave newborns. But they come to serve and protect us, just as they did after the assault on the Capitol. They were here to prevent democracy from being eroded. They were here to protect the president and the vice president. They have been here for us, and we must be there for them. They have been there when many of us had no other hope other than to have them show up to defend us. I remember Katrina. I remember what was happening in New Orleans. I went down there. I saw the National Guard come in. I saw them protect and defend. We have a duty and an obligation to them, and this is our opportunity to fulfill it. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for what you're doing today for a multiplicity of reasons. One being, I don't want to see what happened to the merchant mariners happen to the National Guard and the Reserve. Took them 44 years to get GI benefits. We cannot allow this to happen. So I am there, I am here, and I will be there for them. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've listened to the debate with many others, and so many times it is being misunderstood that Guard and Reserve don't receive these benefits when they're called up on federal. They actually do on many of the existing federal orders. And the Moore Amendment would then allow that to occur. I think many of our members are confused on what they actually are receiving time for towards their GI Bill. And I want to express again that what we're saying is that the overreach here that occurs whenever that 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year, that they know when they sign up for that is the difference, is not going to be credited. With that, I'll reserve.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I want to yield 3 minutes to my good friend who serves on the Education and Labor Committee with myself and the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, Representative Bauman from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It is our responsibility to ensure that our veterans have the resources they need to access care after serving. Every year, brave men and women enlist in the military, seeking to serve their country, pursue a better life, and obtain benefits and security for their future. This means being able to afford college, having access to housing, health care, and other opportunities. Our troops are deployed into active war zones that too often leave veterans with PTSD, suicidal ideation, anxiety, addiction, depression, and other mental health challenges. Regardless of what congressional district you live in, you will always take what happens in your service back home with you. But when they return, our government has failed to provide them with the care and support they deserve. The outcome is a veterans' suicide crisis. The suicide rate for veterans is 1.5 times higher than the rate of non-veteran adults. And I see this in my district. I've had veterans call my office and as a last resort after not being able to access the health care they need in the VA. My constituent services team has had multiple cases of veterans struggling with suicidal ideation and other mental health challenges who have expressed immense frustration that no one in our government seems to care about their well-being. Our veterans deserve better, and we must do better. I am grateful for incredible organizations in my district like Black Veterans for Social Justice, Veterans for Peace, and the American Legion who are leading with care, working to support our veterans' mental health by destigmatizing mental health care and connecting veterans to mental health professionals. They regularly host support groups for veterans with mental health challenges, advocate for a stronger VA system, and provide one-on-one opportunities for veterans to learn about benefits available to them. Our amendment to H.R. 1836 builds upon their work to ensure that when transitioning to civilian life, veterans receive information about what health care and mental health care services are available to them, including how to access the Veteran Crisis Line and seek mental health support. This amendment also specifies that this information should be provided to veterans in a manner that helps destigmatize mental health and encourages veterans to reach out. These are important steps towards creating a society in which every single veteran has access to universal, high-quality health care and is empowered to seek out the mental health support they need to thrive. If you are a veteran who is struggling with mental health challenges, please know that you are not alone and that seeking our mental health support is an important step toward feeling better. During these especially difficult times, we must care for ourselves and for one another. Thank you. I yield back.
Okay. Gentleman yields. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from Illinois reserves.
Mr. Speaker, it is my esteemed honor and privilege to yield 1 minute to a champion and staunch advocate who is unparalleled in our support and her support for our nation's 22 million veterans. This Congress, with her support, we have continued to preserve the sacred trust of our men and women in uniform and the 200,000 service members who become veterans each year. Mr. Speaker, of course, I'm referring to the Speaker of this great House and from the great state of California, my own state, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi.
The gentleman from California, the Speaker of the House, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for yielding, and I thank the gentleman for his leadership in bringing this important legislation to the floor. Our veterans, we owe them everything. They make us the home of the brave, the land of the free. They protect our democracy. They and their families make us so very, very proud. Mr. Speaker, and I thank you again, Mr. Takano, as chair of the committee, and Mr. Levin for his leadership on this particular legislation, which I will acknowledge in a moment. But first, Mr. Speaker, I want to say nearly 8 decades ago, when Congress enacted the first GI Bill, our nation made a bipartisan and unbreakable promise that every hero steps forward to defend our nation deserves the tools to succeed when they come home. Today, the House will proudly take another strong step toward fulfilling that pledge. On behalf of the Congress, I commend the outstanding leadership of the committee chair, Mark Takano, who has ensured that the Veterans Affairs Committee remains committed to its long legacy of bipartisanship. And I salute the chair of the Veterans Affairs Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity, Congressman Mike Levin of California, both, for leading on this important legislation every step of the way, and for his lifetime advocacy on behalf of our military communities. Every time our nation seeks to strengthen and expand benefits for veterans, we have listened closely to the men and women in uniform and our veterans, taking their insight and expertise into account. We continue to listen to them today to build upon our progress and appropriately honor our service. On a regular basis, we have a meeting with our veteran service organizations. The American Legion is very much a part of that, as well as other groups reflecting our involvement in other wars since World War II. And that's where we still have a few veterans from then. What's interesting about this legislation today, to me, is that, again, it sprang from listening to our men and women in uniform and our veterans as to what their needs are. That's exactly how the first GI Bill came to be. The veterans of World War I, recognizing the disadvantages that they were at after World War I, came forth with the proposal to have the GI Bill. So this was passed and signed by Franklin Roosevelt during World War II at the suggestion of veterans of World War I. During the dark days of the Second World War and after listening to the calls of the brave veterans of World War I, President Roosevelt made clear the urgent moral imperative of supporting our returning soldiers. In a message to Congress in November 1943, he said, the members of the armed forces have been compelled to make greater economic sacrifice and every other kind of sacrifice than the rest of us, and they are entitled to definite action to help take care of their special problems. The President said that. I'm very proud that my father was in this chamber as Thomas D'Alessandro, a member of Congress from Baltimore, when he said that his brother would be lost shortly thereafter in battle leading up to the Battle of the Bulge. Less than a year later, Congress enacted the first GI Bill on an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote, marking a turning point in how our nation cares for our veterans. In doing so, we made a transformational investment in our service members, opening the doors to a college education and launching millions of families into the middle class, whether it was home ownership, so many different things. In 2008, it was my great privilege to serve as Speaker of the Congress when we took the crucial step to bring these benefits into the 21st century. With the post-9/11 GI Bill passed on a strong bipartisan vote and signed into law by President George W. Bush, we expanded the promise of a full 4-year college education to veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, and we ensured in subsequent legislation that their families could also take advantage of that benefit. And in 2017, we strengthened this law by improving benefits and closing gaps in eligibility so that we can best serve those who served our nation. Yet today, too many veterans still do not receive equal access to life-changing benefits they have earned. Over the last few decades, our valiant reservists and guardsmen have become even more integral to America's national security strategy. Our reservists often serve side by side with active duty service members, do the same jobs, and incur the same risks. And as our nation has battled the pandemic, our communities have relied on our guardsmen to help protect our nation from the deadly virus. These heroes are essential to keeping our families and our nation safe, but current law falls short of delivering the benefits they deserve. With the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act, we will ensure that every day that our reservists and guardsmen heroes that serve in uniform will count toward their GI benefits. And in doing so, we will lift up hundreds of thousands of current and future veterans across the nation so that they too will have the opportunity they need to thrive in the 21st century economy. Let me be clear, ensuring every service member has equal access to hard-earned benefits is an issue of fairness. When the House passes this legislation today, we will build on a proud bipartisan progress forged by generations of lawmakers in this chamber and in the Senate as well. We show our heroes that they will always have our unwavering support, and we honor this sacrifice on the battlefield. The military vows that on the battlefield we will leave no soldier behind, and when they come home, we pledge that we will leave no veteran behind. There's so much more that listening to our veterans and our service members that we can learn that we must do so that they can take their strongest position when they come home. And in this all-American spirit, I urge a very strong aye vote for this legislation, thanking the distinguished chairman for his leadership and Mike Levin for his persistence, his relentless persistence on the benefit of our veterans as a member of that important committee. With that, I urge an aye vote and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you,
Gentleman
Mr. Speaker.
from California, the Speaker of the House yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it is needed to be, once again, the members of the House can know and understand, because many speakers, including the previous speaker, brought up the fact that those who serve should receive these benefits that actually serve in the battlefield. When they do, they do. Under this existing system right now, they receive that benefit. What we're talking about now is an expansion to those days of reservist, the 2 weekends, the weekend a month, and the 2 weeks a year. It's completely different than the fact that when they're on federal orders. And then the Moore Amendment would actually deal with that and take care of that. That being said, I would like to yield 3 minutes time to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be here today to offer this MTR. If we adopt the motion to recommit, we will instruct the House Committee on Veterans Affairs to consider an amendment to H.R. 1836, which ensures members of the armed forces granted a general discharge under honorable conditions solely for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine are eligible for the GI Bill education benefits of which the Speaker just spoke about. I therefore ask unanimous consent to include the text of the amendment in the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on August 24, 2021, the Secretary of Defense issued a directive requiring mandatory COVID-19 vaccination for all service members, including those in the Ready Reserve and the National Guard. Despite the challenges this vaccine mandate currently faces in court, the Defense Department had proceeded to discharge those who refuse the vaccine. Hundreds of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Guardians have already been discharged, and as many as 20,000 service members remain at risk over being involuntarily removed from service. It's outrageous. To prevent those who have refused the vaccine from being dishonorably discharged, Congress included a provision in the fiscal year 2022 National Defense Authorization Act limiting discharges for failure to receive the COVID-19 vaccine to either an honorable discharge or a general discharge under honorable conditions. This change succeeded in stopping further disciplinary actions or court-martial for those who refused the vaccine. However, it potentially leaves many veterans in limbo between leaving the service with full benefits or having their education benefits stripped as they walk out the door. As many of my veteran colleagues in this chamber know, those service members who received a general discharge under honorable conditions are ineligible for the Montgomery and post-9/11 GI Bill benefits due to restrictions Congress implemented in 2011. While this change was intended to open eligibility status to members of the National Guard, there will now be a group of veterans who have served honorably up until this point of refusing COVID-19, who will now have their education benefits completely wiped out. For those who may not know the full breadth of education benefits entitled to a veteran, let me give you just a couple of items. A veteran who has served at least 36 months on active duty is entitled to 100% of post-9/11 GI benefits. That includes full tuition coverage for public schools, or roughly $26,000 annually for private education or apprenticeships.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
That veteran also receives a monthly housing allowance which varies by location by $1,000 annually to cover books and other school supplies. Add that up, and we're talking well over $100,000 worth of education benefits. And let's be clear on who this is truly affecting. Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about recruits who fresh out of basic training or those discharged at the MEP station. These are men and women who have done their time, who have paid their dues, and who have served with distinction up until the point of refusing this vaccine. And now we're going to tell them that we don't care how spotless their record may have been beforehand. That's because they made a moral, ethical, and even religious objection to a vaccine. Those who have fought to defend our country should not be deprived of the benefits they so rightly deserve simply for refusing to comply with this divisive and potentially unlawful vaccine mandate. My motion to recommit corrects this disparity by ensuring any member of the armed services who receives a general discharge under honorable conditions solely for the refusal of the COVID-19 vaccine is entitled to education benefits. We are a country that rewards our heroes, not punishes them, and this motion to recommit makes sure of that. And I urge the adoption of this motion to recommit, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the issue of how service members are disciplined for refusing to take the vaccine has already been addressed in the National Defense Authorization Act. It already states plainly that there could be a general discharge or another than honorable discharge, or an honorable discharge. There is a seeming to me an irrelevance or just it's unnecessary, this proposed MTR. So we have, we already have a solution that has been agreed to in the armed services space and jurisdiction. That being said, I believe, I do not have any further speakers. I'm prepared to close, and I reserve.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am ready to close, but there's a few things in the closing that I want to be sure and bring up. First off, the GI Bill cannot be included it was not included, and those benefits would be removed if they are refused to take the vaccine. So that is, the MCR is actually a legitimate motion that is something that we do need to deal with. That was not taken care of in that bill. And just so you know, a vitally important issue that was brought up by General Burkman, our speakers that we've had here today, they don't take this lightly. They're very serious about this. They have served themselves. They've served in these capacities. They understand the concern. And the concern of retention in the active force is a serious concern. We just received notice that the Army raised its max bonus for new recruits to $50,000 due to struggling trying to get people to come on to active reserve. By offering this benefit above and beyond, that's been a concern of many of those that have expressed that concern. But let me tell you this on this debate today. I want to thank Chairman Takano and others for thoughtful and respectful debate, which is vitally important on an issue like this. I also want to, Congressman Levin, his passion on these issues was truly present as well, and we understand that. I'm a former Marine. I am a former active Marine. I am a Marine because, once you're a Marine, you're always a Marine. That's vitally important to remember. And as a father of a Marine and of a grandfather of a Marine, these issues are very personal to me. Now, I understand the sacrifices that members of our National Guard make every day. And I think some of the things that were spoken here today confuse the fact that when they get called up to active duty, go over to Iraq, go to Afghanistan, those qualify towards their GI Bill. It does. And I'm not opposed to them receiving education benefits, nor was anybody that spoke here today. But the Guard and Reserve is that. It's a Guard and Reserve. And whenever they're activated, yes, they should receive those benefits. That's why the Moore Amendment is so vitally important that we're going to be talking on later as well. If we adopt that, it will cover everything except that component that those Guard and Reserve members knew when they joined that they didn't get those benefits for that 1 weekend a month and those 2 weeks a year. And why is that? Because it's a separate standing than an active duty military personnel. This discussion, and I know, we all want to respect our Guard and Reserve. But this is not the way to do it. Doing it in the right order, hearing from everyone in committee, discussing these issues, bringing them up, and let input from those stakeholders that are involved was the proper way to do this, not to do it here on the floor in this manner. With that, I think the debate has been really good. I hope that the people that are listening understand. I hope that our colleagues understand what it is, that a vote against this is not a vote against the Guard and Reserve. A vote against this is simply saying, no, there's another way that is more fiscally responsible, that will still offer benefits and reward those for their service. But this is not the right way. With that, I'd encourage my colleagues to vote no on the underlying bill, yes on the amendments that we're coming up with, but no on the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I will, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will, in closing, say that, that the minority has not raised a substantive argument, a serious argument against the substance of this bill. This is a good piece of legislation, one that is agreed to and supported by numerous veteran service organizations. To the issue of, and to the objection raised by the minority over a lack of process and lack of regular order, this is simply not true. We have had ample opportunity for the minority to have input in numerous hearings related to this topic. And as to the concern over recruitment and retention of our active duty forces, I will remind my esteemed ranking member, or the esteemed ranking member, for whom I have great admiration for his own service and the service of his family in the military, that we turn to the Guard and Reserve in greater dependence in the post 9/11 era. And because we were able to turn to them, we did not have to have discussions about a draft. We had issues recruiting folks for our military in the early aughts to the numbers that we needed. And we had to turn to the Reserve and the Guard. So we need good incentives and great retention incentives for our Guard units and our Reserve units all across this country, because we aren't going to depend on them less. In fact, we're going to depend on them more. And the tempo of the training, all we're saying is that the readiness training they undergo, is no less than the readiness training of our active duty troops. Regardless of whether they knew or didn't know at the beginning when they signed up as reservists or guardsmen, they deserve to have every day count. Now is the time for Congress and this House to say that every day of readiness training should count toward GI Bill eligibility. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from California yields back. All time for debate has expired. Each further amendment printed in Part A of the House Report 117-225 shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and the opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 117-225. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part A of House Report Number 117-225, offered by Ms. Ross of North Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 860, the gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Ross, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge support for my bipartisan amendment, which will require the VA to notify transitioning service members of the services for which they are personally eligible. Notification must include information about mental health care, community care under the Mission Act, and care related to military sexual trauma. Troubling reports have found that many transitioning veterans are not aware of the health benefits available to them through the VA. A recent Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General report found that the DoD has failed to provide proper mental health screening and care for transitioning veterans, in part because so many veterans do not understand what care is available to them. The transition away from active service can be a tumultuous time during which many new veterans face mental health issues. Left unaddressed, these issues can be debilitating and deadly. My father served as a psychiatrist in the Air Force during the Vietnam era. He witnessed firsthand the need for proper and timely mental health care among veterans. But mental health resources at the VA can only be helpful to those who know of their existence. We owe a debt of gratitude to our veterans, and they deserve gold standard and seamless access to the benefits that they've earned. My amendment will help new veterans understand and access the care to which they are entitled. Mr. Speaker, I thank Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, Congressman Bowman, and Congresswoman Moore for joining me in offering this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
I claim time in opposition to the amendment, although I am not opposed.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Congresswoman Ross's amendment would require VA to share information regarding mental health care, community care, and other services to veterans who have recently transitioned out of the military. Leaving the military can be a difficult and vulnerable time for many veterans. It is critical that separating service members receive support as they restart their civilian lives. Part of that is ensuring that they are educated and empowered to take advantage of the benefits they earned by serving in the nation in uniform. Now, right now, the education occurs primarily through the Transition Assistance Program, or TAP. TAP was created in 1990 and always includes information on the VA on what benefits are available and services that are those that are transitioning out of the military may be eligible for. Now, TAP is a great program, and it's vitally important because those of us who are older veterans, the only tap we got was on the shoulder and said, hey, good to see you, have a great life. But now, TAP actually has that opportunity. In addition, the Trump administration began a Solid Start program in 2019. Through Solid Start, all new veterans are contacted by the VA 3 times during their first year out of uniform. Those contacts occur 90, 180, and 360 days after separation for service and are a priceless opportunity for newly separated service members to connect with the VA. Congresswoman Ross's amendment would require that the VA provide information to those new veterans, that information, including information regarding the health care, including mental health, community care, military sexual trauma, and the Veterans Crisis Line. As I indicated, VA already provides new veterans with information during TAP and through the Solid Start program. This amendment simply ensures that the materials VA provide to new veterans specifically includes these subjects. For that reason, I am in support of her amendment, and I encourage all of my colleagues to support that. And I thank Congressman Ross and the other co-sponsors of this amendment for their work, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman for his support. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the distinguished Congressman Takano.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of the Ross, Gonzalez, Colon, Bowman, and Moore amendment, and I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Madam Speaker, there is no better way to connect veterans with medical care and services than first making sure that they're aware of the care that they've earned with their service. The Ross Amendment makes sure that VA informs our veterans of this care that they have earned just as they are entering civilian life. The first months are crucial in a veteran's transition out of the military, and the Ross Amendment ensures that veterans are aware of what kind of care and support they can access and how they can access it. So I urge all of my colleagues to support the Ross Amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina is. The gentlewoman has the only time remaining. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this amendment will help new veterans understand the specific benefits that they have and that they've earned through their service. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of my amendment, the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Pursuant to House Resolution 860, the previous question is ordered on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of House Report 117-225. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in Part A of House Report Number 117-225, offered by Mr. Moore of Alabama.
Pursuant to House Resolution 860, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Moore, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of my amendment to replace the underlying bill with the text of my bill, H.R. 2047. This amendment would provide additional eligibility for members of the National Guard who are called up on federal active duty orders for service other than training. As a former member of the National Guard, I know all too well the challenges that they face. The National Guard has transitioned in recent years from a reserve force to domestic missions to a full-time force operating around our globe. My amendment would remove the presidential declaration requirements that has restricted benefits for so many members in the National Guard in the past. It would make it so that members of the National Guard would receive eligibility for time spent under any federal active orders that are not for training. This would provide eligibility for federal benefits to those who support the COVID-19 relief, respond to natural disasters, and protect our southern border. I agree with Chairman Levin that we must take a hard look at the duty status reform and the expansion of benefits afforded to the National Guard and Reserve components while operating under federal active duty orders. My amendment would make it clear that if you're called up on federal orders for something other than training, you should receive eligibility for GI benefits. However, I am concerned with the expansion proposed in this bill that is a little too broad. We should allow the DoD to complete their efforts and better align the benefits to certain duty statuses before we move forward with such a broad expansion. I think General Burkman hit on that point today, that we need to give them time to work through the process. The expansion of every day in the uniform could cost over $2 billion over the next 10 years in mandatory benefits, where my expansion is only $16 million. We talked about inflation in here, and today we saw the highest increase in 40 years. And so This kind of runaway spending, I think we need to try to get a handle on that. My approach, I think, is more surgical, if you will. It allows the benefits to our Guard and service members without just painting a broad brush for everyone in uniform. My amendment ensures that members of the National Guard that are called to action receive access to educational programs like all other veterans, while doing so in a physically responsible manner. Finally, I would like to thank Ranking Member Bost and all the staff for their support on this amendment. With that, I urge all my colleagues to support the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alabama reserves. For what purposes does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to take a moment to highlight for the sponsor of this amendment, Representative Moore, and all members, just how severely this amendment would harm National Guard and reservists from their states and districts. Congressman Moore represents the great state of Alabama, and despite being the 24th most populous state in the Union, Alabama has the 12th largest National Guard in the nation by number of service members. And among the units in the Alabama National Guard that the Moore Amendment would shortchange by eliminating training days, and I say training days are also readiness days, is the Alabama 20th Special Forces Group. Members from this group and units like it must complete roughly 2 full years of training, from basic training through completion of the arduous and highly competitive Special Forces qualification course, just to become qualified as Special Forces Green Berets. In order to maintain a high level of readiness and be ready to deploy when our nation calls on them, these service members must constantly attend additional trainings to maintain certifications and proficiencies critical to their jobs as reservists. And to be clear, this training is conducted at active duty schools right alongside their active duty counterparts. Yet Guard and reservists don't receive the same credit for the days they are in uniform despite maintaining the exact same readiness requirements. Readiness matters. Consider this, in 2013, reservists spent 87,000 days on Title 32 orders, which is how the reserve force assists with floods, hurricanes, and other significant events. However, in 2021, that number had grown to 9.5 million days. This amendment would continue to uphold this unequal policy and prevent members of the Alabama 20th Group from accruing days of service for training. Otherwise, training is another word for readiness. Some states and service members from units like Alabama's 20th Group carry a heavier burden, but this example is not unique to Alabama. All across the country, Guard and Reserve members from every state put their civilian lives on hold in defense of our nation. They give much of themselves, their sweat, blood, and sometimes even the ultimate sacrifice in service. And whether during training or deployment, they deserve the same benefits for their days in service. They've earned it. Finally, I would also note that the Moore Amendment uses the same IRL rate change found in H.R. 1836, which we agree is a fair update to the IRL program. Let's be clear, a vote for this amendment is a direct statement to our Guard and Reserve service members that you don't think that their days in service are equal to those of their active duty counterparts. Representative Moore served in the National Guard, and I thank and commend him for that service. Now I know that he is a humble man like most of our service members, but I think his days in service should be honored and given their due credit. And I know he may have participated in ROTC, but if his education wasn't fully paid for by that program, then I think he should be given credit for his National Guard service for GI Bill eligibility. And I urge Representative Moore to reconsider his submission of this amendment and urge all members to oppose the Moore Amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And with that, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Bost, for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
The gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of Congressman Moore's amendment, H.R. 1836, as amended, the Guard and Reserve GI Bill Parity Act of 2021. While I do not support the underlying text of the bill, I believe that Congressman Moore's amendment, of which I am a co-sponsor, would make important common sense changes to it. The underlying bill would make a vast and costly expansion of benefits to Guard and Reserve members to include the GI Bill eligibility for every day in uniform under federal orders. This includes GI Bill eligibility for weekend drills and training. As I stated during the general debate earlier, I believe that this bill's $2 billion mandated cost is using rare offsets that take away from the priorities that this committee has in serving our nation's veterans. That is why today I stand in support of Congressman Moore's amendment. The substitutive provisions would simply simplify current law so that any time spent on federal active duty by members of Guard and Reserve for services other than for training would count towards the GI Bill eligibility. This would include service in support of protecting the southern border, federal funded missions in support of efforts with COVID-19, and other critical active duty missions. The amendment would only require $16 million in mandatory offsets compared to the $2 billion. The underlying bill would cost. Not only is this policy change good for the nation's veteran, but it does not burden our children, grandchildren, and future generations of American taxpayers with tens of billions of dollars over several decades in unfunded offset costs like the underlying bill would. This is without question a more measurable and fiscally responsible approach to more fully honor the valuable service that these men and women of the Guard and Reserve perform. I want to thank Congressman Moore for his hard work on the amendment, and before yielding back, I would like to say that if a person votes against this bill, it is not a vote against the Guard and Reserve. It is a vote for the taxpayers, which Guard and Reserves are also taxpayers. And it is the reason why we should have had a more full debate on this bill in committee so these things could have been brought up. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alabama's time has expired. The gentleman from California is recognized.
May I inquire as to how much time I have?
The gentleman has 1 minute and 15 seconds remaining.
Well, Madam Speaker, let me just say there's nothing common sense about this amendment. There's no common injustice to our reservists and our Guard units is not common sense. Unfairness to our Guard and reservists is not common sense. To say that this is a fiscal burden to our nation who depend on our Guard and reservists in natural disasters and who our nation relies on, who will rely on even more in the future, to say that that is a fiscal burden, that is not common sense. Madam Speaker, it is time to make every day of readiness training that our reservists and our Guard unit members perform, to make every one of those days count toward their GI Bill eligibility. The GI Bill, as Madam Speaker, as Speaker Pelosi had said, did amazing things for this nation in the post-World War II era. That same amazing contribution of our reservists and our Guardsmen will continue, and I yield back, and I urge all members to vote against this amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 860, the previous question is ordered on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. For what purposes does the gentleman from Alabama
I'd like to request
seek
the yeas
recognition?
and nays, Madam Speaker.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device.
job. Good job. Thank you, sir. Well done. And I told Justin, I think it's actually one of the more substantive